And what I have in mind here is simply, it's a very straightforward format. It's just a review, more or less, of some of the ways in which these two things have appeared in 20th century art, and more particularly how this same transition we've been looking at in several other respects through this series, between painting in particular, other arts in general, and architecture operates here too. Whether to the detriment or advantage of architecture. So, in this particular instance, I just want to say that in just the same way as what we were talking about last week, abstraction became a kind of almost like a definition of what 20th century art was about. So at certain points, not quite so consistently, the idea of fragmentation became that. More particularly, the notion of ambiguity does flourish fairly constantly throughout the 20th century as one of the key characteristics of 20th century art. Mind you, these two things, fragmentation and ambiguity, aren't the same. They're connected, though, in particular historical circumstances we're talking about, and particularly in Cubism. And since so much of what we're talking about, what we'll talk about this week and in the next lecture, has to do with that, this going back, this constant retrieval of ideas from that period. It's not too surprising that these two things, fragmentation and ambiguity, should be closely aligned with one another. But I also want to talk about the periods when they divorce as well, because they're at least as interesting. So I start off with this, which could have been one of thousands of buildings, which I could show simply to illustrate something which I think is curious in this transition that we're talking about. We'll see in a minute how the idea of pictorial ambiguity is established in Cubism. But when the ideas of fragmentation that go with that are transported into architecture, that they come along with something else, which is also quite familiar already within architecture, which is an idea of picturesque composition, which is quite different to what was happening in Cubist paintings. And so, for example, in here, you can see that this strange kind of operation where the new building, apart from these perhaps quite adventitious effects, which are nevertheless very common, where the individual elements of glazing and their distortion within the frame produces distorted and fragmented pictures of, in this instance, itself across the other side there, and also other buildings. So that's like a kind of little rehearsal of some of the things that are so constantly present in Cubism by a kind of architectural accident. On the other hand, the actual arrangement of the buildings, their disarrangement, and their sort of incomplete character, the fact that things are obviously arranged so as to make some kind of general but apparently not unified arrangement, and to correspond in many ways with the kind of buildings that act as backdrop in this instance, shows this kind of strange double sense that one gets in this use of fragmentation as a principle within architectural design. On the one hand, going back apparently to Cubism and what was happening there. On the other hand, related to the picturesque and things which have been established in architectural practice for a lot longer, and whose meaning, and by that I don't mean just simply some kind of iconographic tag that one can put on it, but the real general sense of that is fundamentally different to that of Cubism. So we've got two ways in which one can take these things already. Very, very clearly manifest. Nor is that entirely restricted to architecture. I think it's quite interesting that during the 60s, when Robert Smithson was producing some of these kinds of projects, you know, this ectopic landscape, he was very interested in 19th century park design, Olmsted and so forth, and the way in which those constructions, these man-made constructions, seem to, on the one hand, by trying to imitate natural conditions, were producing some kind of tectonic idea about the organization of things, which he was picking up on himself, and which he likened to the entirely accidental array of industrial landscape in New Jersey, for example. So Olmsted and New Jersey seem to him very closely related. But I don't want to, well, two things here. Firstly, another observation about fragmentation and ambiguity. They're essentially different things, not only because one can kind of sort of separate them and see them applied to different things, because they're already about different things. So fragmentation is what you do to a thing, and ambiguity is the sense that you make of something. So really, here again, we're talking about two things which are seen to be codeterminate at a certain point, but may not be. Now, in terms of fragmentation, let's just take that one for a start. Although it can be put forward as a characteristic mode of 20th century thought, and we can think of James Joyce and his mode of writing. We can think of Cubism and various kinds of other enterprise, and we can think of more general propositions that were put forward by people like Marshall McLuhan in the 60s, which suggested that all perception, all 20th century perception, is essentially mosaic and fragmentary in this way, although it had a different kind of unity which one could discern from it. That isn't the only proposition. There are other ways of construing what is the essentially modern condition of understanding and perception. And I just put this forward as an observation here, that there's a man called Michel Serres, who over the past 20 years or so has been putting forward the notion that not so much to do with this kind of discontinuous, fragmented discomposition of reality, but that there is another idea which is equally potent in 19th century physics, which is where he sees its origin, in thermodynamics, which is to do with a totally continuous but totally indeterminate set of phenomena, what he calls the accretion vortex, which is really things like the weather system, or the behavior of fields of force and so forth, which can't, except in the most uncertain way, be dealt with mathematically, but which are nevertheless immensely interesting. And he compares that kind of physics with the painting of Turner on the one hand, and with the novels of Zola on the other hand, to the effect that Zola's novels, he sees, are really novels about steam, because everywhere you go there's just steam and atmosphere filling everything. And it's true, if you look at some of the Parisian novels, the Guggenheim Macaire series, there is an awful lot of steam in them. So it would be possible to construct other ideas about a characteristic mode of perception or distribution. And I'm not putting this forward as the typical one, but only one that has made a tremendous impact on the visual arts. So let's start with Cubism, where apparently these ideas have their, if not their origin, at least their most effective early expression. And as we were saying last week on the issue of abstraction, the very interesting thing about this period of art was the fantastic negativity associated, a very kind of active negativity. That is that there's a tremendous destructive urge afoot in the, not so much the writings of Picasso and Braque, who are doing this part, but everything that surrounds them, later Cubists, certainly the Russian writers, Lissitzky, Malevich and so forth, and of course the Futurists. And this destructive idea is related to all sorts of conventions and habits, which these artists see as something which must be got over, that there are these incredible impediments to vision, which have been produced by this repetition and rehearsal of the same thing over and over and over again, and that these things have to be removed in order to see things properly at all. And if there's one common thread that joins all these things, obviously they had their arguments, it was the idea, for example, that they were getting rid of perspective vision. This also mentioned last week. And this is particularly interesting, I think, in the way in which not the actual painterly development of this idea, which is in a way beyond words. It happens in various ways. They take various kinds of subjects and treat them to something which is a kind of pictorial enterprise, and as Picasso was very well aware of, obviously, and all too keen on telling everybody, it wasn't an intellectual enterprise. They didn't have any ideas. Braque says he has nothing to do with ideas, he's only to do with material, that's all. He's a painter, not a philosopher. Very much interested in what seems to be an entirely compositional notion at first hand. I don't know whether one could hold that in that entirely kind of pure way, as Cubism is only this abstract compositional operation. But certainly they were conscious of trying to make it like that. Two main painters, Picasso and Braque, during that period from 1907 to 1912-13, Cubism was fledged, is what I'm saying. So it would take something like this, which is Picasso's portrait of Ambroise Vollard, which is done in 1912, and characterized as fragmented. But also, the more important thing to us is this association with the fluctuation of the pictorial surface and ambiguity. So that, obviously, these two things are aligned quite well with one another. So that, for example, the fracturing, this shard-like fracturing of the surface, which almost looks as if it were a sheet of glass which had been smashed, but not quite. I mean, it's not painted. I mean, these aren't those kind of break lines, but one can see it in that light if one wishes to. And a kind of reconstitution of something which is anyway visible. The actual subject matter hasn't been made invisible at all. It's been subject to certain kinds of dispersal and rearrangement on the surface, but it certainly hasn't been it hasn't been abstracted in any other way. It's been broken, basically. But at the same time, what has been thoroughly dealt with is the sense of pictorial depth, and that really has gone. That what would be really a fairly standard portrait with a background and the head of the sitter with the upper part of the body has become flattened in another sense, that the pictorial surface is kind of much thinner. It appears to be, to the observer, to have no real extension back into the virtual space behind the picture. Well, all these things are terribly well known about Cubism. Or terribly well reversed. They are part of our understanding of what these things are like. But I think one thing I'd like to come back to is a point that's raised insistently by Gombrich, which is taken up by a writer called Winthrop Judkins, Jr., who wrote this thing called Fluctuant Representation in Cubist art from 1911 to 1913, taking only the works of Picasso. Right? So it looks like something has been written by an actuary. I mean, it's lists and long kind of systematic breaking down of things into various categories, and it looks like the most boring book in the world. It's actually incredibly interesting, because what he does, Judkins, is instead of just talking in the way that I have been just now, in rather general terms about this idea of the fragmented surface and the shallow space of Cubist painting and so forth, he actually itemizes all the means that these artists use to make this ambiguous representation possible. That is where you could see things two ways. Normally it's two ways. That also I'd like you to bear in mind. It's this ambiguity can mean any number of interpretations, but what we're almost always talking about in terms of the visual arts, and often in terms of literature, is duality. That is an oscillation between two possible readings of something. There might be a multiplicity of circumstances in which that oscillating duality occurs, but it's usually like that. And the way that Judkins makes this list of, I think it's 66 categories of the various ways in which these artists make this fluctuation possible, is usually in that mode. But one thing that he is very strong on, Judkins, which there's only a modest little introduction, interpretive introduction on the rest of the lists. But one thing that he is very insistent upon is the prominence of projective techniques in the way this thing was accomplished. I mean, all sorts of different ones in the same painting. Like you could have perspective, reversed, so say Byzantine perspective, where things diverge rather than converge. Oblique projections, orthographic fragments of the picture and so forth. And this he's very clear about. He says that this is what makes the hallucinatory reading of these things so powerful. There's multiple ways of breaking up all sorts of different ways in which we have learned to see things and reconstituting them in these surfaces of these paintings. Now, I forget what I was going to say about this, except that, yes, I was making an entirely idle observation, but there is also another thing here about the disappearing image. That is, that in the Voile portrait you can easily see what is being depicted. And clearly one can talk about seeing it in face and in profile, for example, if one wants to do that, because there are clues as to what's happening there. This thing, another Picasso in 1913 called the Architect's Table, it's much more difficult to do that. One can see there are all sorts of identifiable things there, but this entirely hallucinatory idea of it being like seeing things, this is again another constant stated idea, both in the early period of Cubism itself and much later. But what we're doing when we're looking at these paintings is not so much seeing this kind of entirely mechanical, so to say, idea of perspective, transmitting an image from a station point there to the fixed eye point of the observer, but something which is really like seeing the act of sight itself, which is after all mobile for a start, but more than that, it's constituted through memory. That is, that we understand more than what we see. So there are all these other things that crowd in on the image. So this becomes like a kind of a picture of the manner of perception, not a picture of things. All that also is fairly clear. But there is a point at which this picturing procedure becomes almost textural. That is, that things disappear from it so much, and the fragments get so small that one's left with the idea of something which is really just a textual accumulation rather than something that's been broken. But now, sorry, that was a diversion really. Back to this idea of the orthographic nature, in particular, of Cubist art. There's a very interesting statement by George Braque in 1909 when he was asked, he was giving an interview, and he was asked how, when he was drawing, say, a woman, how he constituted the image. And after some kind of remarks saying, well, he was not interested in what the woman actually looked like, because nobody anyway could paint a woman in that way. It was just impossible to do justice to the actual woman, and so on was trying to do something else. He then moves off to a thing about reality. That perspective, this great beast perspective which had to be killed, perspective was not so much, say, illusionistic, but it was about a kind of constituted image that wasn't really like the real thing. And what he was trying to do was get back to what was real about the things that he painted, And the analogy that he used was that of the architect. The architect does the same kind of thing, he says, when he does drawings. He wants the real links, and so he does elevations and plans, because this conveys more of the actual constitutional reality of the object than do these perspectival distortions, which are mere kind of epiphenomena, really. So there's a funny thing here about, on the one hand, being about perception, on the other hand, going back when it seemed useful to an idea about reality, which is quite sort of unregenerate. I mean, this is the oldest idea about reality that we have. That real lengths and the angles between things constitute an actual tangible, literally tangible, measurable reality to them. Now again, I want to come back to this next time we meet, when I want to talk about axonometric and the fortunes of that as it passes through the 20th century, because we see that kind of idea is very prominent in the revival of axonometric ideas of the last 20 years, and also in Lozitsky's work in the 20s on axonometric. So you see, for example, this is not Braque but Gree, but you can see the way in which, and I want these kind of explanatory diagram, that an actual circle, this has been broken of course here, so it doesn't actually meet, but something which is more like a kind of plan form circle of the two things is combined with something more like the elevation of it, and that happens even more prominently and clearly up there. And these things crop up in Cubist paintings and purist paintings also in tremendous profusion. This double flattening of elevation and plan at the same time. As Judkins points out, the interesting thing about orthographic projection is it forces you to break things up. No whole picture of anything can be got in any one shot, so it forces the breaking up of the surface. Consequently, that leads back into this other aspect of the compositional order of these paintings, which uses that fragmentation to good effect. And again, with the work of Linda Dalrymple Henderson on, she's the lady who's done this fantastic compilation of references to the fourth dimension in 20th century art. One thing that she illustrates, I think is tremendously interesting, is this thing from a mathematical journal in the 1880s, which is a very serious study by a mathematician of ways of making legitimate projections of four-dimensional solids. So I'm sort of talking about business that they're trying to make kind of illustrative diagrams of the way these things which were beyond construction in three-dimensional space actually operated. And Humphrey finds this really rather complicated method of doing that. The technique for us is unimportant, fortunately, but the appearance is very important. What the Cubist painters, who sometimes literally, as Dalrymple Henderson makes clear, sometimes in their less lucid moments, took these diagrams and put them in their paintings. What they were doing, it wasn't so much illustrating the fourth dimension, it was illustrating this fluctuation that was in this kind of drawing, which is after all just another version of orthographic projection, with all that kind of fracturing that was implicit within that, in any event. So we see a kind of strange thing of, on the one hand, wanting to leap over and leap away from this terrible bondage of perspective representation, but on the other hand, being compelled to revert back to something which is actually much more primitive than that, in order to get over the hurdle, which is the idea of tangible, measurable, real relations in actual objects, which doesn't square terribly well with the perceptual idea, but is nevertheless very effective within the constitution of the pictures themselves. That after all is the real subject matter, not the explanation. The other thing, the thing about ambiguity is that it's really a rather loose term in that it can be applied apply to almost anything. And that, for example, when in the 50s and early 60s, Clement Greenberg took it upon himself to characterize not just 20th century paintings, which was 20th century painting in America, but all painting as essentially to do with the surface. He was saying that not only abstract expressionism and not only Cubism, but all painting relied on this same paradoxical ambiguity about reading a kind of pictorial space into the surface, and on the other hand, seeing the thing as mere surface, so that even something which is as totally concerned with perspectival depth as this Antonello da Messina painting from the 1450s can be construed of as a flat surface, and that's part of the magic of looking at illusionistic paintings. His idea was that that magic was rather kind of exhaustive, and that what we should do is simply look at the surface, because that after all is more intriguing at this particular moment. So, in other words, there is an implicit ambiguity in all pictures. That's certain. But what one can say about the Cubists is that they accentuate and augment that to such an extent that it becomes the major constituent of the painting. Now, the issue of how this travels over into architecture is, of course, one which you can't fix on a particular way. The first instances of trying to make Cubist architecture are things like this exhibition villa designed by Duchamp-Villon in 1913 and exhibited in the Paris exposition. And it's very literal, and as everybody says, it isn't really Cubist architecture. All it is taking what appear to be the constituents of a painting, a Cubist painting, and realizing them in three dimensions. And of course, the tremendous difficulty with something like that is that you lose all the sense of the painterly constitution of the thing, and it simply becomes a kind of model of something which you think you can see, which you think you can intimate within the painting. So all the ambiguity is pretty well lost in that transmission and the literalizing of the sculptural object like that. Well, that again is well understood, and these things are seen as really rather faulty beginnings of an idea of trying to push some aspect of Cubism into practice of architecture. Another, which I think is also subject to exactly the same criticism, actually, is that taken by, much later, by Siegfried Gideon, who, in his desperate efforts to constitute a picture of 20th century culture as a whole, as entirely unified, art, sciences, architecture, painting, the lot, went to some efforts to show how, as again we saw in relation to abstraction last week, show how painting was related to architecture in its underlying concepts and constructions. And when it comes to the issue of the fragmentariness of Cubism, which he feels he does have to deal with, his way into it, which is the same as Moholy-Nagy, where he borrowed the idea. He even borrowed the picture, which he retook. This is a picture of, well, you can see what this is, the Rockefeller Center. It was a collage done by somebody called Repton, Thurman Repton, in 1929. And it really is it's quite decorative, as you can see. But what Gideon did in 1939 was to take this rather appealing set of photographs and do a remake, which isn't terribly good, and print it in his book as an illustration of the way in which 20th century vision is conditioned to fragmentation and a kind of reunification. And that what the Cubists were trying to do was to simply show that we could see things, as it were, through memory and movement, as having various aspects and not just the fixed high point of traditional perspective. So that's again a commonplace enough idea. I think the problem with it, trying to use it as a way of making architectural ideas, is that nothing of the Cubist enterprise itself travels into the architecture. So you have a kind of a transmission of total loss, if you like, because there is nothing of ambiguity or fluctuation or anything like that that comes across. Because after all, anything, if you're going to see it like that, you're just going to see it like that anyway. The nice thing about a painting is you can talk about seeing perception through a painting, because it's 2 dimensions, but in 3 dimensions, where you're actually perceiving and doing and being, you can't. So this was a little problem, I think, that one comes across again and again in these attempts to wrest the basic fundamental constituents of this painterly art form and transfer it into architecture more or less directly. Now we saw again last week, to show the same slide again, how in the case of Corbusier there was something very interesting going on, rehearsal of following Rowe's argument, in the way in which the material constituents of those villas of the 20s and the interleaving space between them was somehow made almost equivalent, so that the difference between the space and the substance was really made hard to discern. There's nothing particularly difficult when you come down, I mean, there's nothing particularly problematic about it. It's not greatly mixed, it's not like that. But what's happened here is that there is an ambiguity, a tremendous ambiguity, but it's nothing like the same constituents or the same process of construction of that ambiguity as in Cubist painting. Now, a lot is made of the way that Corbusier, in particular, is a painter as well as an architect, and how he takes ideas from painting and, as it were, kind of constitutes them in architecture eventually. I think what's particularly interesting about what does happen there is it quite clear that he was a very accomplished painter and a quite remarkable architect, but that the transmission between these things is not as direct, even as it seems. And I think we can probably go back to that idea and see that in another way by looking. So this is an Ozenkran purist painting. By looking at the work of Van Doesburg again, as we were last week. Sorry, this is I'm completely out of sync because what I was just going to show this as an example of the kind of painting that the purists were doing during that period. This being Ozenkran rather than Corbusier, but you can see, firstly, that tremendous what they take away from Cubism is a lot of those multiple ambiguities, leaving only one, really, of an uncertain reading of what's on top of which. So it seems to be like a clearing away of so much of this multiple ambiguity into one particular one, and of course that is the one that by implication can be extended back into the architecture through the logic that Colin Murray's in his article on literal and phenomenal transparency, which is a very interesting article. But again, it's very different in a painting than it is in a building, and again, we'll come back to that in a minute. One last point, to get back to this idea of the picturesque. This is not so much architecture as kind of topography, really, topographical art. Linus Feininger uses architecture as a subject matter of Cubist painting. I think here again, where he starts off as doing this rather kind of militarized straight lines cutting through space and matter, idea of Cubist organization, applying it to buildings like this church in Eltham. What happens by 1930 is that the sense of this has changed slightly. He's looking at things like this thing called Ruin by the Sea, for example, here. And I think this is a really remarkable illustration. They're not remarkable paintings by any stretch, but they do show something which is a kind of borderline, a very interesting borderline. It goes back to that first slide again. You can take this discomposition, to use a word, not from Derrida, it's from Boccioni, this discomposition of the pictorial surface, this breaking up, this fragmentation, and see it as an act of violence performed against some prevailing set of concepts or practices, And certainly the artists from that early period of 20th century art were seeing their effort in very much that destructive way. Gleeful destruction. It was really quite wonderful. But there is a subtle transition that can occur anywhere along this line, another kind of hidden ambiguity in this thing, where it shifts over to a kind of sadness at the act of destruction which one is witnessing. Now, which line is, which side of the line things are on is sometimes hard to discern, sometimes very easy. And here it's very definitely drifting across to that sadness in recollection of something that must once have been unified, but which has been broken by various things outside of one's control, which after all, one, as an artist, is only recording in some way or another, as opposed to the early Cubists who were actually doing the smashing, which was a very different act altogether. So these are, I mean, these hardly need connected to that earlier slide. That a retrospective idea of the constitution, of the deconstitution of things that were once whole and great, is of course it's one of these kind of recurrent things, right from the Renaissance, right from the 17th, 18th century, through the 19th century, and here you can see little kind of echoes of it in where you wouldn't expect it in the Cubist art in the 20th century. This is from Robert Allen, the ruins of the Palace at Spolata. I think this is probably unnecessary here, but we'll do it quite quickly in order to move on. One or two things about the futurists and the difference between their enterprise and that of the Cubists. What's interesting, I think, in this regard is that in terms of the actual practices of painting that the futurists were undertaking, they were very much dependent on, well, punctualism for one thing, and later stages of Impressionism first, and then Cubism. But the fragmentation of the pictorial surface is one thing they use, not so much here. This is an early, relatively early painting by Boccioni, The City Rises, so in 1911, where you can see those earlier techniques being kind of put to new use. And as we'll see, also the pictorial techniques of the Cubists, which they quite happily took and used. But their interpretation of what they were doing was vastly different. And here again, there's something quite interesting about the way in which it arose. In terms of the way in which they justified their art in relation to 19th and 20th century physics, they were actually, I think, much more effective than the Cubists. Not necessarily as painters, but in that regard. There were two things here. One was to do with the idea of fields of force, which they picked up from Faraday and various physicists from the 19th century. A field of force is, of course, something quite continuous, and what it suggests is, A, that the world is made out of forces and not the obdurate, static, dead things. That was a nice idea. That everything animate and inanimate was totally energized. The other thing was that we never saw what was actually there. We didn't see reality because our mind was constituted. This is something I took from Bergson. Our mind was constituted in such a way that all our perception did was focus things for us so that we store them in our memories. And because that was true, we isolated, analyzed, and individualized things so they could be, as it were, put in this little box of ours. But essentially, this wasn't the real constitution of things, which was basically this pullulating and completely indefinite field of interactive forces, which is so nicely, well, brilliantly pictorialized in that painting of Boccioni's. But a year later, a year after that was finished, Boccioni is doing drawings like this, which are clearly very, very dependent on Cubist sources, explaining them in much the same way, that this shows the intersection of a table, a bottle, a window, and some houses across the street. So it's called table plus window plus bottle plus houses. And But you see the compositional techniques are identical and almost indistinguishable, except for that kind of flurry of more circular lines at the top there, curved lines, from what the Cubists were doing. This is the painting that followed from that, which again, in terms of colour even, is more Cubistic. I'll go through these because really it's nothing more than illustrations of the way things are busted. And I think here again, one of the things that fascinated, one of the reasons why the Futurists took so well to the Cubist enterprise was because they saw also this need to, this desire to break everything that an act of violence performed on the pictorial surface was pretty good in itself. Whether it was the best way of illustrating this internal consistency and energized state of real matter was probably not quite as important as the fact that it registered that degree of destructiveness. Let's go through this because that's so obvious it really doesn't need pointing out. It's just to do with this thing of continuity and discontinuity and the fact that although the Futurists were so preoccupied with this idea of continuous flux, what they ended up doing was actually making discontinuous images of things, like this of the flight of swifts by Braque, in order to illustrate the fact of being interested in it, using, of course, the photographic techniques that have been developed by people like Braque in the late 19th century. Now, to this point, I'd like to just twist back. The kinds of things we've been talking about, we see in a particular way. We have constructed, over the past 40 or 50 years, with the help of the statements of the people who are embroiled in this business themselves, a fairly clear idea of the revolutionary nature of the Cubist and early modern episode in art, which I don't think is unjustified, I might add. But nevertheless, there are some very, very strange likenesses between this and something which we would see, again, like the critical construction of what things mean, as on the complete opposite side of the line, which is late 18th century picturesque. This goes back to what we were talking about by the beginning now. For example, it's hardly worth pointing out the fact of fragmentariness, and the fact that it doesn't matter whether things fit together. In fact, there's a deliberate attempt to make things that don't fit together so that one kind of can constitute an idea which has to, as it were, by an act of force, pull them together and unify them in some way. That happens in 18th century gardens as a historical unification that one perform on these things. And it happens in Cubist painting as well, in terms of trying to, as it were, fixate an image among all these ambiguous ones that are presented. But if you look at this, which is probably from Repton, who can stand for the most conservative, not with a big C necessarily, although he was a conservative in that sense, conservative in terms of the preservation of two things: the idea of a fiction about reality as opposed to reality itself. Now here I think we come on really interesting but very dangerous ground in relation to 20th century practice. But I'd like to just kind of go through this for my own sake as much as you, to see where it leads. If we look at, for example, this illustration here, or anything done by Repton, Repton's whole ambition was to do away with explicit boundary. That is what he was trying to get rid of, is divisions between things. So that in a way, the art of that period, and Repton in particular, in relation to gardens and the general landscape, is an art of trying to get rid of things that are actually there and which are habitually and constitutionally present. So in that respect, it's also somewhat similar to the Cubist idea of obliterating consciousness of what was habitual in their time as well. But of course it works rather differently. Now, for example, we can take something like the composition of Nash or or a Repton piece of architecture and say, well, they're obviously just fragmenting and redistributing something, which it works in the same way. That is what they do, is they take something which is always understood first off as something symmetrical, and then they start playing around with the relocation of elements within that schema. Now, again, if you look at the way that Cubist painting develops, it develops from an idea of a constituted image which is broken up to a certain extent so that one can sense something of the image's presence within there, but there is enough breakage going on so that we're getting rid of its most definitive characteristics. Likewise with this kind of composition here. So, actually the other thing which really interests me an awful lot is that they come up with this different printing technique at just the time when the picturesque becomes really important in England, where this idea of getting rid of things which illustrate civilization, that is the straight line in particular, is being embarked upon. They come up with this kind of printing which does away with the linear character of engravings before. Is it called aquatint? I've forgotten. Anyway, in the 1790s, this comes into play. And you can see here that what it does, if you look at the surface of these things, they're made up of just cracks. It's a kind of chemical process rather than a kind of engraving process. And it just cracks the surface of the plate, so that all these things are made up of kind of cracks. And they're overpainted in this instance, but that in itself, there aren't any lines in these things. The lines have all gone. It's just these cracks, this great texture of cracks, of greater or lesser density throughout the whole thing, which I think is part and parcel of that whole thing. And if you look, for example, at Richard Payne Knight and his reconstruction of Downton, this is a before and after picture done by an artist, Thomas Stone, who was in the employ of Richard Payne Knight. And Knight was, I think, much more radical than Repton in the way he used the picturesque. We'll come back to Repton in a second. But you see, here's the before picture, and here we see these rather ugly and unsightly lines made by this canal-like river, probably constructed by a follower of Capability Brown, and the absurdly kind of pristine line of this bridge here, and all these other things, not to say what's happening in the actual architecture itself. And look what's happened. This great obfuscation of the line. If you read the literature of these people, it's also incredibly interesting in the degree that the lengths to which they go in order to get rid of any lineation whatsoever. So, for example, in the book on Payne Knight's book on the landscape, he talks about ways of particular kinds of ways of planting and putting gravel down so that you can't discern the edge of a path, for example. There are other writers like Edmund Bartell and Gilpin who go on a great deal about how to make cottages in such a way, for example, you don't use white stucco, you use highly textured coloured targeting, so that the thing kind of looks the same colour as the circumstances in which it's in, and it's the same sort of texture as it is. You use recessed window frames, and you make sure that the lines aren't quite straight on a kind of wholesale social delusion. But on the other hand, I'm not sure that that actually applies to the situation now. 40 or 50 years later, we pick up on ideas which are taken from this source of ours, Cubism, and see them implicatable in architecture, which anyway is very easily confused with the picturesque principles of the 18th century. And what situation does that put us in? I think it's a very different one, actually. And I think it's much more similar to the 18th century one. I'll just put that forward as an idea, at least. We'll go. Well, let's not worry about this. Just one last point here about continuity and discontinuity. Again, that one, that's just a mnemonic for me. There is a very interesting thing that happens, I think, in the 20s in relation to the way in which these things spread. I've been talking about a certain difficulty of making the transition between painting and architecture. not necessarily an impossibility, but it's definitely it's a very, very difficult transition to make, to preserve any of the original qualities and still have this thing in this other medium. But it does step inside. I mean, not only in terms of literary practice and the writing of Ulysses and all that kind of stuff. There's a fantastically interesting comment made by an artist called Anderson, I've forgotten his first name. He was a Danish architect who was a friend of Niels Bohr. Niels Bohr was a physicist who was instrumental in the development of what's called the complementarity principle in the account of it's part of the development of sorry. It's just gone. But in terms of the behaviour of particles and how we can visualise these things, and maybe how we can't visualise what's going on, this was a hot debate in that period of the mid-20s. Heisenberg, Niels Bohr, and many other people didn't understand the bulge in this thing. And what Anderson said is that Niels Bohr was an avid interest in Cubist painting. He liked to play with drawings and so forth, and had these things up on his wall. And he confided in Anderson that one of the things that gave him an insight into the possibility of the complementarity principle was this fluctuation, this strange thing of not being able to tell whether a thing was one way or another in these paintings. He'd been looking at these things, and that just struck his mind as a really interesting aspect of them. The complementarity principle is this thing about not having any clear distinction between whether matter is light and all these institutional phenomena are made up of wave motions or of particles. So there's a kind of atomic idea of having them as kind of individual little bits all stuck together, and there's an idea about a motion, a wave, which they can't be completely integrated. One can have one account for some purposes, the other account for the others. They both seem to be good ways of describing certain aspects of the same thing, but it's a dual account of reality that's being presented. This is very similar in this story, at least, that is derived from the ambiguity of the pictorial surface in Cubist painting. Now, that's not a way we're inclined to see things. We tend to see it working the other way, and that is that Cubism is pulling all this stuff from 19th century physics and using it. But it clearly is an incredibly potent kind of presentiment that's being put forward in that work. Right, now I think it's getting late, and what I'd like to do at this point is just carry us to a point where we were also last week, so when we come back we can carry on with this. Look at this, which is, they're not very good things to compare, Piet Mondrian from 1914, where the organisation is cohesive, of all things intersect with one another, and this thing, which is another, Theo van Doesburg from 1919, in which something very peculiar has happened. It looks a really unhappy painting, a very uncertain painting. But both Bart van der Leck and Doesburg were very interested in doing what is perfectly clear here. It seems like a kind of childlike thing of taking all the bits apart and just sort of putting them, almost as if one was putting them in some kind of index order on the pictorial surface itself. So one has the kind of underlying phenomena of the canvas or the paint, and then these little bits just stuck on. Now, the magic of this, says Doesburg, is in the mutual relations between these things that are set up and which are kind of complementary and which are totally unified. I mean, one doesn't have to believe that that's actually what we're looking at, but this is the intention, the ambition of this idea. So consequently, one's looking really at something which is immensely different. The same pieces have just been moved apart, space made between them. I mean, yes, it's two-dimensional space, isn't it? It's not a metaphor. and their individuality clearly established, but at the same time there is this other stuff in between. Now, thinking back to Corbusier and his management of getting a different kind of ambiguity into architecture, one can see that actually Van Doesburg was moving on very, very similar lines, but from a different logic. I mean, the painting operates more powerfully in Doesburg's work, I think, directly speaking, on his architectural ideas than it does in Corbusier. But in a way, it's by mucking up all the Cubist ideas that he gets to this point where he can make the transition. Look at that, and then we'll go back to this again. What I'd like to leave you with here is just one observation about this thing, one of which you made last week, which is the fact that the stone axonometric, which I want to pick up on when we meet again. The other is to do with two things which actually don't occur in this. It doesn't have any ambiguity to speak of at all, nor is it fragmented. Both those characteristics are utterly absent in this thing. It does have ambiguities, but they're not the kind that we've been talking about. So if, for example, think of this as the painting is, I think, incredibly naive, maybe not uninteresting because of that naivety, but naive nevertheless. This, I don't think, is naive, but it's constituted in exactly the same way. That is, that it's completely independent elements, which don't make any kind of business of intersection with one another. They can, in fact, sit on one another occasionally, but that's not very often. Mostly, it's completely independent things which define a three-dimensional space as a kind of gap between. Now, just in the same way as Corbusier was operating with this ambiguity between surface and space, so I think is Doesburg here in these counter-compositions and these playing around with architectural and compositional devices. I've done it deliberately upside down, just to point out the fact that the ambiguity in this is orientational, which is again what we were talking about last week, left, right, back, front, up, down. It's ambiguous that way. But it's not spatially ambiguous. There's absolutely no spatial ambiguity. One can see perfectly clearly where all these things are meant to be in relation to one another. There's none of that. So, in a curious way, what we have here, which I think is one of the greatnesses of these things, incidentally, is that they relinquish what appears to be the essential element of Cubism, this insistent search after ways of making things oscillate between one meaning and another, between one sense and another, in favour of something which is in fact pictorially completely unambiguous. The ambiguities arise in terms of a spatial understanding of the thing, which is actually three-dimensional. So again, it's actually lost that flattening off of the image, part of 3%. So what I'd like to leave you with is simply this very much more radical transformation of sense in this thing than is apparent if you just simply regard it as a set of elements composed on space rather than on two dimensions, as rather like Cubist construction, which is exactly what Gideon was doing, because he wanted it to be continuous. He had to have that continuity. What's immensely interesting about it is the discontinuity that it sets up between its own origins and what it actually is. I think that's probably where I ought to leave it. Thank you. So can I just repeat then that just because next week, because next week is the last week of term, it seems to me better to do the last talk at the first week of next term rather than next week, because I know last week is the first. Thank you.